Hi. This is quite possibly the brightest bunch of lights I've ever had to talk in front of. I feel a bit like that scene at the end of Close Encounters where he's standing in the desert and the spaceships are coming down and you can't see what's going on in front of you. Hi, thank you very much to you all for being here. It's always a slightly sort of strangely anticlimactic feeling to find yourself on the big stage after a David Crystal plenary. I won't be talking about Shakespeare particularly, and I'm afraid I won't be doing any rapping or any different accents. What I will be doing is talking about English futures and the kind of futures that I think our learners are going to be facing in the years to come. And I first really started thinking about this in any kind of clear way a couple of years ago at Harrogate. And probably many of you were at Harrogate IATEFL. And David Graddle was there, and he was doing a plenary one morning called English and Economic Growth. And David Graddle's obviously a man who knows a lot about this kind of area. He's been involved for a long time now with the English Next project, looking at the growth and the spread of English, particularly in the BRIC countries, in Brazil, Russia, India, China. And he's written very, very detailed overviews of the role and the development of English in countries like India and Brazil. And in this particular plenary, David Graddle was outlining two main futures that he saw for our learners in the years to come. And the two main futures are, at one end, you're going to be having the students who are around A2, B1 level, basically pre-intermediate kind of learners. And what David Graddle was saying was that these students are essentially only going to be using their English for professional purposes. And generally, the professional purposes that they're going to be using their English in is going to be very, very niche. The example that he gave during this particular plenary was call centre workers. And as I'm sure you're all aware, if you're working in a call centre, you're going to be providing help, providing inquiry services, could be for any different number of particular institutions, for banks, for pharmacies, for travel agents, for embassies, etc. And often the call centre jobs are jobs which have already been outsourced from native speaker contexts to lower wage markets. And they're a very, very cost-sensitive kind of area of the economy, like many of these jobs that employ students or learners who speak English at these low-end levels. And generally, the way that the corporations who run things like call centres operate is they hire low and then they aim to train up. And many, many call centres and many other providers in this kind of low-end service industries have started increasingly using the Common European Framework when they're looking to hire. And unsurprisingly, what they're looking for in the people that they're hiring is higher spikes in their profile for listening and for socio-linguistic competence. And they're much less interested in your reading and writing abilities. And they're using the Common European Framework to correlate the kind of position that your English is currently at, focusing particularly on those kinds of areas. And the way that call centres work is really interesting when you think of your own experience of using call centres, because there's an incredible subdivision of process by desks. And usually what will happen is you'll be hired into one of these companies, maybe you've just about reached B1, and you'll be put on one of the simpler process desks. So you may be put on, for example, dealing with lost credit cards. And the aim then is that over the next 6 months, internally and externally within the companies, your level of English gets to a sort of B2 level, and you're able to move on to the next sort of process desk. And this explains why when you phone a lot of service centres or call centres, and you have multiple needs, you want to report a lost credit card, and you want to transfer some money, and you want to talk about house insurance, you end up going through 3 different people, 3 different calls. Because actually inside the company, those will be 3 entirely separate sections on different levels of pay with slightly different levels of English at each stage. And obviously the people who go into those companies, what they're looking to do is to sort of upgrade themselves to where they're getting near C1 and they can be moved on to the more complex process desks which pay the better money. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got you guys, basically, most of you. Those of you who are non-native speakers and who are here attending the IATEFL conference. You've got the super fluent non-native speakers. The kind of super fluent non-native speakers who, for me, make a mockery of the whole English as a lingua franca debate. The kind of super fluent non-native speakers for whom C1, C2 level, for whom proficiency isn't an end point in itself, but is actually a starting point towards another destination, towards being functional bilinguals. I was in Ukraine last week and was talking to one of my Ukrainian friends there who, to all intents and purposes, could easily have grown up speaking English, but obviously didn't as a first language. And he was asking me, when am I considered bilingual? And it's a very interesting question. If you're a non-native who basically speaks super fluent English, at what stage do you get your English recognised as being functionally bilingual? And I think a lot of the time, these kind of super fluent non-natives, and they're a growing group of people in the English language using and learning world, they're often in many ways better at using English as a medium of international communication than many native speakers, for whom English is primarily a badge of identity, a badge of in-group discourse. And these kinds of people are going to be teachers, they're going to be scientists, they're going to be academics, they're going to be business people, they're going to be engineers. And they're not only going to be doing very, very complicated jobs in impeccable English, they're going to be reading widely within their field and outside of it. They're going to possibly be presenting at conferences, they're going to be writing papers, giving papers. They're also, by definition, going to be well-travelled. They're going to be in the higher end of the socio-economic kind of brackets. They're going to be able to use English for a wide range of social purposes as well. And while they may not be native speakers, they're basically able to do almost everything that native speakers can do. So, if you accept this argument, and if you believe the research that David Graddle's been doing, these are our students' futures. And if you add on top of that, what then happens in developing countries? At the moment, the vast majority of developing countries are places where there are very, very young populations. They're very kind of forward-thrusting, they're growing populations. They're countries where there are far fewer dependents and where there's a far larger percentage of people working than in the aging developed world. And in these particular kinds of regions and countries in the developing world, if the economies are to continue growing, obviously what needs to happen is an upskilling of the workforce. And a large part of the upskilling of the workforce involves moving people from this kind of A2, B1 level up to C1, C2 and beyond. Many of you may well be living and working in countries where, the government suddenly decides this is the year of English. I was in Ukraine last week for the IATEFL Ukraine there, and 2016 has been officially declared the year of English, in a bid to try to, shift a larger number of people from this lower end kind of level of language skills up to this higher end. At the same time, obviously, countries also need jobs which enable them to exploit these new skills. And when you look at a lot of countries, like, for example, India, about which David Graddle's written, you've got an added complicating factor, because you've got a birth rate that's now so high that the country itself is struggling to keep up with the infrastructure needed to cope with the growing population. They're struggling to build sufficient primary schools and to train sufficient teachers to cope with the numbers of kids coming into the population. And if you then decide that you're going to somehow drop English down into primary schools, you've got this incredible added level of strain. I'm sure many of you, again, are either living or working in countries where there's a stated official desire to move towards bilingualism or to move towards trilingualism. But often this is done while the teachers themselves, who are supposed to be bringing the next generation of kids up to Cambridge First Certificate level, may themselves only be at PET level or at KET level. And when you've got a situation where you're needing to train the adults in order to train the children to become the highly skilled workers of the future, I think you've got a system which is placing a huge amount of strain on itself. And I would suggest maybe, instead of trying to do this, we might want to start by thinking about the approaches, the methods, and the tools that we're bringing to the situation that we're already in. And, excuse me, sadly, I think, if you start examining the kind of context and the kind of content that we're often disseminating through English language classes, what you start to find is that we're operating in a realm where I think outmoded and outdated ideas, methods, and approaches to content still predominate. I wish I could say that we were utilising a 20th century approach to deal with 21st century problems, but I think actually it's worse than that. I think we're still very much using an 18th century way of looking at things in the 21st century, because a large amount of English language teaching orthodoxy is still rooted in this 18th century attempt to impose the kind of cold, dead rules of Latin and ancient Greek onto English as it became disseminated across the country. And as the first grammars based very much on the idea of Latin and Greek and on the written language started to emerge. And we're still living with that legacy. We're still trying to sort of rid ourselves of the shackles of that particular kind of past. And I think you can still see this legacy in EFL classrooms all over the world. What you generally see is the input that we tend to provide for students is based on the discrete graded presentation of grammar and the study of individual grammar rules. It's based on the presentation of single words, often with bilingual word lists. And on top of this, there's a focus on culture, whatever that might mean. And often, not exclusively and not as much as perhaps it used to be, but still often, the culture of native speaker environments, native speaker contexts. And added to that as a kind of icing on this particular cake, if you like, is a highbrow focus on culture's cousin, literature, with a capital L. Teachers are still trained to believe that a grammar plus vocabulary plus single words plus skills approach will help them to produce better outcomes. And as a result, most publishers still publish in a very similar kind of vein because we're told this is what the market wants. And so we go round and round in a sort of vicious circle. And I think it's worth asking ourselves, is this really what our students need? Excuse me. If you look at the Common European Framework, and if you look at what the big corporations who are hiring out there are defining skills in English language in terms of, what they're basically doing and what they're looking for is a definition of competence in the language which is based on the individual's ability to perform particular communicative tasks. Often very specific kind of communicative tasks. This is what the can-do statements in the CEFR and so forth are guided towards. If you look at the way in which can-do statements have sort of filtered down in this strangely diluted form into English language teaching, a lot of the time what you find is the can-do statements are either simply grammar in disguise, so they're things like, I can talk about experience by studying the present perfect and past simple. I can talk about rules and regulations by using must, mustn't, don't have to, and can. Or there'll be can-do statements based around very woolly, very free-form, fluency-oriented activities. So there'll be things like, I can tell a ghost story. I can create a radio advert. And even where the language is taught to help students meet these kinds of communicative goals, which I think is still quite rarely, I think we need to step back and ask ourselves, are these actually the most useful or the most desired conversations that our students are going to need when they step out into this English future that David Gradle's explaining and talking about? I think sadly, even at lower levels, where there's an opportunity to try to help students to have quite clear conversations which match real-world contexts and realities, a lot of the time, the kinds of speaking that we're asking students to do in classes bear little or no resemblance to any kind of professional or even social contexts or communicative situations that they're going to engage in. But if you think for yourself and the conversations that you have socially, take that classic staple of low-level English language teaching, describing people. When was the last time you slipped into a conversation that one of your parents or one of your partners is quite tall, relatively slim, and has long curly hair? You know, I suspect very, very rarely, if ever. I think on top of this, the way that we tend to tackle grammar and the way that grammar is still broken down into little atomistic chunks and disseminated through ELT material tends to lead to a very, very restricted exposure. At low levels, we spend 20, 30, 40 hours looking at the present simple. Then we move on to the present continuous, but not the present continuous for future use because that will muddy the waters. So instead it's the present continuous for saying, I am riding a bicycle and you are washing your hair. Then maybe we move on to the past simple, regular forms only. And you might be thinking, well, so what? This is how it needs to be. But I think the so what is, by doing this, what we're doing is we're creating a very distorted reality. We're distorting the way in which language is actually used. What we're doing is inadvertently creating the kinds of students I often interview in London who believe that a question must be answered with an answer using the same tense as the question you've just asked them in. And at the same time, it denies students the opportunity to get a deeper, broader sense of how real communication actually works. Because we're not showing them how structures interact with each other, how structures interact within particular kinds of communicative contexts. And you don't need to listen to spoken English for any period of time to realise how ridiculous this idea of asking and answering in the same tense is. You know, it's all around us. Someone asks you, have you been to see the library yet? Not yet. I was thinking of going there tomorrow. Have you been to see the library yet? No, but I'm going this afternoon. What about you? Yeah, I might go down there later. It depends if I've got time. Why did you decide to do that? I don't know. We'd been talking about it for ages, you know. This is just normal. This is what we do all the time when we're conversing fluently. And this is what the atomistic block-by-block grammar approach deprives our students of the opportunity of seeing and experiencing. And I think, you know, rather than doing this, students need to see how tenses interact with vocabulary and how they interact with other structures within particular kinds of discourses. On top of that, I think, this artificial separation of grammar over here, single words over here, it makes life much harder for students when it comes to using vocabulary as well. In essence, what this asks students to do is to go out into the wide world and every time they want to open their mouths, to perform a kind of alchemy, a kind of magic. This first came to me many years ago when I was working at the University of Westminster in London. And I was waiting on the third floor, waiting for the lift after one of my classes. And I was standing next to a Korean student called Nanju. And the lift came and the doors opened. And Nanju was sort of standing there, not getting into the lift, talking to herself in this weird way that looked like she was writing on her hand. And I was quite curious about this. And so I let the lift doors close. Nanju, what's the problem? Why didn't you get into the lift? She said, okay, lift doors open at the moment, temporary action, present continuous, I know, I am plus ing, you are plus ing, question form, are you plus ing, is it plus ing, I know. Phrasal verbs, I know, go up, go down. British English, American English, I know, lift, elevator. Okay, what's the problem? What do you say when the doors open? Okay, good question. I said, well, you just say, are you going up or are you going down? And she looked really, really angry and said, so easy when you know. And you know, language is so easy when you don't know, when you know. If you don't know, you're forced to perform this kind of magic where you're putting together your grammar rules and your phrasal verbs and your British and American English and somehow hoping that out of all of this, you'll produce something which conveys some kind of message. I think, on top of that, there are also problems connected to the lingering influence of big capital C culture and of literature. I think there's still a tendency towards, although as I said, a tendency that's mercifully slowly reducing, towards presenting these very rosy British tourist board kind of presentations of the country, where we have lots of happy stories about our royal family and our supposedly wonderful legal system and our grand history. And I think all of this fails to take into account the fact that for many, many students, increasingly in the modern world, they have a far more complex, far more nuanced kind of relationship with the native-speaking world than this would lead them to suggest. On top of that, I think, the problem with literature, which is sort of brought in under the umbrella of culture a lot of the time, is we end up with a classroom full of language beyond the level and very much tenuously connected to any kind of outcome which might aid or assist the students in their communicative life outside of the classroom. One of the most painful lessons I've ever observed was a young teacher who'd just come off the back of a CELTA course and was keen to bring literature into the classroom, using an extract from Dickens with an intermediate class and spending 10 minutes trying to explain what a parlour was. Despite the fact she had never been in one, I'd never been in one, the students are never going to go in one, and this is kind of the things you find yourself sucked into because you brought those things into the classroom. So, that's where we're at, I would argue, at the moment. And I think where we're at the moment is we've stuck with an approach and with a methodology and with a way of chopping up and presenting language which is very, very good at producing intermediate level students. I'm sure you've all heard this idea of the intermediate plateau, and I'm sure for many of you in your teaching contexts, intermediate is the vast bulk of the students that you end up teaching and meeting. The sad thing is, intermediate students are the one kind of student that David Graddol is suggesting that nobody wants. So we've got this system that's producing thousands upon thousands of students that are neither one thing nor the other. They're not good enough at niche conversations in work kind of contexts, in specific kind of service sectors, to do those jobs without a considerable amount of training. And they're miles away from having attained the heights of these elite professionals. On top of all of that, I think, a further problem is they're hampered by their previous learning experiences. They come to us with these ideas of how language works and what they think their needs are that are out of date and that are unhelpful in terms of pushing themselves forward. So, what to do? At this stage, because officially this is supposed to be a workshop, what I'd like you to do with the people next to you, I'll give you 2 minutes, okay, is just to discuss among yourselves what to do. Give you a couple of minutes, okay? Don't be shy. What to do? Can I stop you there? Sorry. Oh, one day I'm going to feel really guilty as the cardiac arrest kicks off in the back of the room. But I think, in terms of what to do, in some ways we already have some pointers and we already have some guidelines. And for me, documents like the Common European Framework do suggest a sort of outcomes, goal-oriented way of teaching and a way of thinking about what we're doing. But if you accept that the idea of teaching towards communicative goals or towards particular outcomes is the way we should be going, I think what it means is the grammar and vocabulary that we focus on in the language classroom has to be subordinate to the communicative task. It can't be the grammar that's driving the communication. It has to be the end point or the goal that drives the grammar and the vocabulary that's brought into the classroom. I think it also means we need to be focusing and filtering out and trying to prioritise kind of communicative tasks or endpoints or goals or outcomes which mirror to some degree the students' real-world needs, either now or at some point in the imagined future. Those of you who work in business English or English for specific purposes, I think those fields are already much further down this kind of road than general English often is. I think what we need to be doing is moving much more towards what Andy Griffiths and Mark Burns in the States have called backwards planning or teaching backwards, where basically you start by defining what your objectives are going to be for the next lesson, for the next day, for the next week, for the next year. You define your goals very, very clearly. And then from that, you work backwards towards thinking about what language is actually needed in a very broad, holistic kind of sense of language. What models are you going to provide? What support are you going to offer? What scaffolding are you going to use to take students to the point where they can do those things? So if we return again to David Graddle and to those low-end learners, and you consider what you actually need in terms of language to be able to do something like these kind of jobs, that, many of our students, this is going to be what they use their English for. I think what it means is a different set of priorities to often what we're seeing in general English classrooms. Perhaps first and foremost, it means a much stronger focus on spoken language, and also not only in terms of kind of presenting spoken language to the students, but in terms of making sure the students themselves are intelligible in their own production of spoken language, and possibly a lot more work on pronunciation. I think it means a much more keen focus on accents and exposing students to a receptive understanding of a wide range of different accents, both native and non-native. I think it also means exposing students to a broader range of structures than they're currently being exposed to, but often in a very limited, particular kind of way. So for me, a student at elementary level, very sensible if they learn how to use a question like, have you tried ing? Okay, and thinking about what the ing might be there. And learning how to use those questions in particular kinds of contexts without yet having to do everything else with the present perfect simple. I think also we need to be thinking about presenting students structures with lexis that those structures are most often used with. So rather than teaching, I can touch my nose with my tongue, I can walk backwards in a straight line. Far better to be teaching things like, I can see your details on the screen now. I can do that for you later. I can help if you want. I think we need to be breaking away from thinking about teaching grammar and teaching words, and instead, right from the beginning, starting by focusing students much more on the mass mess of chunks and bits of language that are sort of somewhere in between those two poles. And possibly, rather than teaching culture with a capital C, we maybe need to be thinking about teaching kind of socio-cultural aspects of the language that perhaps we've neglected. Things like, polite request forms. Do you think you could just say that again? Every time I try and teach these, my students always look at me like, can't I just say it again? Or can you say it again? And of course the answer is yes. And if you're talking to another non-native speaker, possibly you're going to be fine by just saying, say it again. If you're working in a service sector where these things become incredibly important and there are possibly old, resentful people who don't like the fact that their call centre's been outsourced to a non-native speaking environment and who are, wary of talking to people with whom they don't share a whole first language, those kind of things suddenly become much more important. They suddenly become much more to do with the kind of emotional rapport you're able to strike up with the native speaker that you're speaking to in that kind of detached service sector context. I think also what it will mean is we should start seeing a lot more courses at sort of A1, A2, B1 level geared towards particular kinds of employment sections, with the realisation and the acceptance that that's the limited kind of goal that people are aiming for at this stage. At the top end, you know, the people who wanted to become, you guys, the people who wanted to become these kind of elite semi-bilingual users, I think the main thing we need to recognise and need to really think about is the language load. To get to first certificate, you need to be really good at using, recognising, processing quickly around 3,000 words. To get to Cambridge proficiency, you can double that and then probably add some more. You think about what that means in terms of how much language we're expecting students to take on board and deal with at each level. You're talking about a minimum of 750 new items at each level. I think on top of that, for these high-end users, there's a very deep need for sort of a wide, automated repertoire of phrases, expressions, sentence starters, whole pattern stretches of discourse. There's a need both for informal, colloquial kind of language, as well as being able to write across a range of different genres. And there's also a need to be able to perform in English the kind of skills that these high-end jobs require in the 21st century. To be able to do things like weigh and discuss evidence, assess claims, discuss strategies, discuss proposals, those kinds of employment-specific or academic-specific things which have particular linguistic items connected to them that help to perform those things pragmatically. I think what this means is there's a few things that mercifully we can all possibly start to worry about less, and a few things we maybe need to start prioritising. I think three things that we need to be worrying about less are, the first is hair-splitting grammar. And we've all been there, I'm sure. If you've ever found yourself in a classroom trying to explain the difference between will and going to for making predictions, stop, they're both fine. You know, if you ever found yourself fretting about what's the difference between he's lived there 10 years and he's been living there 10 years, you'll sound fine saying both of them. Move on, there's other things to worry about. I think it's also time that we need to start critiquing, rejecting and moving away from this rigid, atomistic, block-by-block unpacking of grammar, and this idea that certain structures can only be encountered by students at certain levels. And possibly we need to move away from teaching culture, particularly if that focus is exclusively or semi-exclusively on native speaker contexts. Perhaps broadening that out, but also perhaps thinking maybe a bit more about the socio-cultural linguistic aspects of use, and possibly a bit less about the kind of big capital C culture of native speaker environments. In terms of worrying more, or reprioritising, or retooling what we're doing for the 21st century, one of the interesting things for me is we often think about kind of preparing for 21st century students in terms of technology and in terms of the tools that we're bringing into the classroom through tech. And obviously, it's important for us as teachers to keep up with these things. It's important for us as teachers to experiment with these things. But I think if we're asking which tools should we be using in order to help our students, we're asking the wrong question. The first question we need to be asking is, what language do we need to be using these tools for in order to help our students meet their goals in the 21st century? And unless you start by thinking about what the language and what the content is, in a sense, the tools that you use become a kind of irrelevance. You're kind of getting onto one stage before you've thought about the foundations, worrying about the house before you've built the ground floor. So I think perhaps first, before we worry about any of the tools or the tech or any of these things, we need to start by clarifying outcomes. We need to start by thinking about what it is we think our students want to be able to achieve in English and how it is we're going to help them. I think we need to be probably focusing more on pronunciation and focusing more from day one. I often have that very dispiriting task of having to tell students who come to me in London, students who've been studying years and years and years and who on paper are technically upper intermediate, that we're going to put them in a pre-intermediate class because no one can understand them. And because their whole experience of the language has been based on writing and reading. And they haven't learned how to perform the motor skills necessary to persuade other people that their English is as good as we know it is when we see it on paper. I think we need to maybe focus more on receptive understanding, both of accents, as I said, but perhaps also receptive understanding of particular kinds of grammar items. We need to focus more on these kind of prefabricated blocks and chunks of language, multi-word items, the kind of items that bridge grammar and vocabulary. I think we need to be realistic with students, and we need to stress the need for massive amounts of acquisition, massive amounts of learning. If you're working at a school that's promising students that they're going to increase their IELTS score by 1 in 6 weeks, or move from elementary to advanced in 6 months, you might want to think about moving somewhere that sets more realistic goals for your students, because it's a long road, and we need to be clear and honest with students about the fact, you want to get to Cambridge proficiency, you're going to need to take on board and learn and acquire and proceduralise a lot of information of about 7,000 words. Good luck. That's not going to happen by tomorrow. I think at lower levels particularly, and this is something Bruno Leys is going to be talking about in his talk, if any of you get the chance to go to it, we need to be thinking about teaching grammar as lexis, as phrases, just as we do in our very first lesson with absolute beginners, where we just teach, hi, what's your name? And we're quite happy teaching that as a phrase, rather than as an example of the verb to be, or as an example of a possessive adjective. I think we need to be doing more of this. We need to be prioritising and focusing on teaching and recycling and revising high-frequency lexis. And again, particularly at lower levels, something quite a few of us have been talking about for a few years, we need to be accepting and exploiting the role of the first language in acting as a bridge to the second language. I'm going to stop there. Hopefully I'm going to throw it over to you to see if there's any questions. A couple of things I should just finish by saying. If anyone wants to get in touch or ask questions or harangue me or anything like that, I'm accessible at Hugh@Lexical Lab. If any of you do Facebook, I'm also there. I'm also just in the process of setting up a language school in London called London Language Lab. So if any of you are looking to come study in London or sending students to London, please contact me and talk to me about that as well. I should also say I've got a methodology book coming out in July called Teaching Lexically. And if you're interested in winning a copy, if you go to the Delta stall connected to the National Geographic stall, you can see copies of that and you can apply to win a sample. You can also see on the National Geographic stall copies of the course book series I've been working on called Outcomes. Thank you very much. Go on, do you want to do the clapping first? Thank you. Can I just ask if anyone's got any questions that you're immediately dying to ask? Yeah, someone at the back there. Hi. Yeah. Yes, I hear you. I don't know if all of you heard the question. It was just about this problem that we all have as teachers of persuading the powers that be, parents, agents, that you do need this amount of time to get to where you want to go. And sometimes you lose business because of it. I mean, when I used to be in the university, we would have people come in saying, I need to get IELTS 6.5 next month. And you say, have you taken the IELTS exam before? They'd say, yes, I got 5.5. I've taken it 3 times. You're not going to get to 6.5 next week. And they would be angry. They'd say, not the answer I wanted. And in the end, you can either be honest with them and say it's not going to happen, go somewhere else that's going to promise you this. When you don't get it, come back to us and listen to us. Or you can lie to them. And, those are your choices in the end. And sometimes you will lose business in the short term because of that. Sometimes those people will come back to you in 3 months saying, I took it again, I got 5.5, I need to get 6.5. Okay, you need to enroll on a 6-month course. That's the reality of the situation. And it's not an easy sell, and no one wants to be told things are hard and things are difficult. We all want to be told life is simple and things are easy. But it ain't true. And so you have to choose between lying and being principled. And, that's for you and your conscience to decide. Any other questions anyone wants to ask? Yeah, someone here. Personally, I think it's problematic. I think the problem with using authentic materials is, who are they authentic for? They're certainly not authentic for an elementary level student. I know the arguments are that, this is the language students encounter outside of class. Except actually, the problem is, if you're exposed to language that's too difficult for you, the vast majority of it will go over your head. I speak sort of upper intermediate level Indonesian. When I'm watching serious documentaries about politics in Indonesian, I don't acquire new language from it because it just kind of goes and I sit there thinking, oh God, my Indonesian's rubbish, I can't do anything. If you were to give me a text that had been based on something authentic but graded down to my level, and where 90% of that language I was able to deal with, and the 10% was something useful and new for me, personally I think it would be a far more beneficial kind of experience. I think the other problem is when you're using authentic text for low levels, either they're kind of strange Mickey Mouse texts that we found that may be authentic and elementary in terms of their language load, or we do these sort of patronising tasks where we say, okay, you can't understand 90% of this text, but can you find what time David got up? And the students go, don't understand, don't understand, don't understand. David got up at 6 o'clock, and we go, great, you see, you can deal with authentic texts. And secretly, they know you're lying to them. So my own feeling is they're not authentic for language learners. An authentic text for an elementary language learner is one that's written for an elementary language learner. Yeah? Do we have one more question anywhere? Yeah, at the back here.
It's about the importance of the role of the mother tongue.
Yeah.
Could you extend a little bit with some
Yeah.
practical examples on it?
I think for a long time in English language teaching, and obviously it depends on the country and the context, but L1 use and the use of translation has been a taboo. And there's been this kind of myth that somehow students will learn to think in English. And we're deluding ourselves because it's not what happens. For me now, even as a sort of upper intermediate advanced level Indonesian speaker, if I don't know how to say something in Indonesian, the easiest way for me to find out is to speak to someone who speaks English and Indonesian and say, how do you say something like, they've been stepping up their campaign? Okay? And I thought, oh, that's a difficult one. You say blah, 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 blah. And I get that whole phrase or that whole chunk, and I learn it as a whole phrase or a whole chunk. I think the problem with translation is, if we're translating discrete grammar structures, or we're translating single words, we're storing up problems. If we're translating whole sentences or whole chunks, we're catching students as they fall in the gaps between the two languages. So I get Spanish speakers who are supposedly intermediate, and they still say, I have 32. 32 what? Cats, dogs, girlfriends? And they've still got to this stage, and because it's such a deeply ingrained thing for them to say in Spanish, I have 32, they haven't noticed that it's different in English. If what you're doing is translating the whole sentence, and you're using the Spanish to get back to the English, the weak students, or the ones who haven't noticed, will go, easy, I have 32. They check the English, I'm 32. Different pattern in English. So I think the translation works very, very well. And I'm sure, for me, this is where tech comes into its own. When I'm learning Indonesian, I use Quizlet a lot. And I make my own kind of Quizlet cards, and I test myself. But what I'm testing is whole sentences. And, when I'm feeling lazy, I'll look at the Indonesian, and I'll remember the English. That's simple for me to do. When I want to push myself, I'll look at the English, and I'll try and remember exactly, word for word, how that's expressed in Indonesian. And sometimes it's annoying. Sometimes I think, stupid language, why don't they do it the way I do it in English? But that's a way that you can kind of bridge technology and translation and try to help students to deal with some of the memory load. We're asking them to remember a lot of language. And if we're asking them to do that without even exploiting what's offered to them through their first language, why? Why are we making life that much harder for them? So I think it's just time for particularly non-native teachers and bilingual teachers to reclaim translation as one of your great strengths and one of your great capabilities that you can bring into your own classrooms. I'm going to stop there because I think I'm running out of time. If anyone else wants to come and talk to me, I'll be on the Nat Geo stand in the main hall. And please do come and say hello, ask anything you want to ask, and thank you very much again.